A father slapped a poor virgin for being useless. In the snow outside a frozen church, his daughter stumbled away, barefoot, bleeding and praying someone, anyone, might see her worth. The wind howled through the empty town until 5 mountain men rode down from the high ridge. Rough hands, scarred faces, and hearts more decent than any preacher's sermon. They didn't come to harm her. They came to save her. But when the town saw them together, whispers turned to fury, and the father swore they'd hang before sunrise. What did those 5 men truly do in that lonely cabin on the mountain? And when the truth rides down to town, who will God stand with? The men of faith or the ones who still remember mercy? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through tears that froze on her cheeks, Mary Haskin stumbled down Main Street. Each step crunched in the freshly fallen snow, marking her path away from the only home she'd known. Her father's words still rang in her ears, sharper than the bitter wind that cut through her thin dress. "Useless girl! Can't even cook a proper meal without burning it!" The Reverend's face had twisted with a familiar rage as he'd struck her, sending her sprawling onto the floor. The taste of copper filled her mouth where her lip had split. Mary touched her swollen lip gingerly, wincing at the sting. The wind howled between the buildings, whipping her skirts around her legs. She hadn't even had time to grab her shawl before her father had thrown her out into the snow. Already, her fingers were turning numb. Through the gathering dusk, she caught glimpses of townspeople hurrying past. They averted their eyes, quickening their steps. A few whispered behind raised hands, their words carried to her on the wind. "The preacher's temper runs hotter than hellfire these days. Poor girl, ever since her mama passed. Ain't right, treating his own flesh and blood that way." But none stopped to help. None offered shelter from the storm that was building. Mary understood their fear. Her father held too much power in the small town. Who would dare defy the Reverend? Shivering violently, Mary made her way behind McGill's blacksmith shop. The rough wooden walls offered some shelter from the wind, though the cold still seeped through her clothes. She huddled there, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to preserve what little warmth remained. "Dear Lord," she whispered through chattering teeth, "please show me your mercy tonight. I need your guidance more than ever." But only the wind answered, whistling through the gaps in the wooden planks. The church bell began to toll, its deep resonance carrying across the snow-covered town. 8 bells. Mary had rung those bells countless times herself, calling the faithful to worship. Now each toll seemed to mock her predicament. The light was fading fast, and with it went what little warmth the day had held. Dark clouds roiled overhead, promising more snow. Mary knew she couldn't stay behind the blacksmith's shop all night. She'd freeze for certain. Rising on unsteady legs, she peered around the corner of the building. Main Street was empty now, the townspeople having hurried home to their warm hearths and suppers. The thought of food made her stomach clench painfully. The stew she'd burned had been their only meal for the day, and now she'd have nothing. Memories of her father's face, contorted with rage, flashed through her mind. She touched her lip again, feeling the dried blood there. In all the years of his anger, of his harsh words and harder hands, she'd never seen him quite so furious. Something in his eyes had been different this time, a finality that told her there would be no forgiveness, no return. The storm was growing stronger, the wind driving ice crystals that stung her face. Mary looked toward the foothills that rose dark against the evening sky. There were caves up there, she knew, where shepherds sometimes took shelter with their flocks. Perhaps she could find one to wait out the night. "Better to die under God's sky," she murmured, "than beneath my father's roof." Taking a deep breath, Mary stepped out from behind the blacksmith's shop. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, but she steadied herself against the wall. Snow was falling heavily now, reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead. She began walking toward the foothills, each step a battle against the wind and her own exhaustion. Her shoes, meant for church services rather than trudging through snow, offered little protection. Soon, her feet were as numb as her hands. Mary thought of her mother's Bible, left behind on her bedside table. It was the only thing she had of her mother's, and now it was lost to her, along with everything else. The pages were worn soft from years of daily readings, marked with pressed flowers and her mother's careful notes in the margins. A sob caught in her throat, but she forced it down. Tears would only freeze on her face, and she needed what little strength she had left to keep moving. The wind howled louder, drowning out even her thoughts, driving the snow horizontally across her path. Through the swirling white, Mary could barely make out the shape of the foothills ahead. They seemed impossibly far away, though she knew they weren't more than a mile from town. Each step became harder than the last, her sodden skirts weighing her down, her fingers and toes beyond feeling now. She thought of the stories her mother used to tell her, about pioneers who'd survived worse storms than this. "They kept their faith," her mother would say, "and the Lord provided." But tonight, Mary's faith felt as numb as her body. The wound on her lip had stopped bleeding, though it throbbed with each gust of wind. It would leave a mark, she knew, another scar to add to the collection her father had given her over the years. Most were hidden beneath her clothes, but this one would show. Perhaps that's why his rage had been so terrible. Visible marks might make the townspeople talk more than they already did. A particularly strong gust of wind caught her, sending her stumbling to her knees in the deep snow. The cold bit through her dress, but Mary found she didn't have the strength to stand immediately. She stayed there for a moment, breathing heavily, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. "Please, Lord," she prayed again, "show me the way." But the snow only fell harder, and the wind continued its mournful keening through the trees. Looking back, Mary could barely see the lights of the town through the storm. Each window glowed with warmth and comfort. Families gathered around their supper tables, safe from the bitter night. She thought of her own small room in the parsonage, with its narrow bed and faded quilt. It hadn't been much, but it had been home. But that was gone now, as surely as her mother was gone. Her father's words, "Never return," had been final. There would be no reconciliation this time, no quiet apology in the morning, no pretending the bruises didn't exist. Mary forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The cold was seeping deeper now, making her thoughts sluggish. She knew she needed to keep moving, to find shelter before the cold took her completely. The foothills loomed closer now, dark shapes against the swirling snow. Somewhere in those hills was a cave, a hollow, any kind of shelter from the wind. She just had to keep walking, one foot in front of the other, like her mother had taught her when she was small. "Just put one foot in front of the other, Mary girl," she'd say, when tasks seemed overwhelming. "The Lord will guide your steps." So Mary walked, though her feet had lost all feeling. She walked, though the wind tried to push her back. She walked, though her heart felt as frozen as her hands. She walked because the alternative was to lie down in the snow and let the cold take her. And something in her, something that even her father's cruelty couldn't extinguish, refused to give up. The storm grew fiercer, if that was possible. The snow was so thick now that Mary could barely see where she was placing her feet. She stumbled often, each time finding it harder to rise. Her prayers had become a continuous whisper, though she could no longer feel her lips moving. Lord, help me. Lord, guide me. Lord, save me. The wind seemed to snatch the words away before they could reach heaven, but still she prayed. It was all she had left. Her faith, as battered as it was the only warmth remaining in her frozen world. The light was almost gone now, the storm turning the early evening into deepest night. Mary could no longer see the town behind her, couldn't even be sure she was still heading in the right direction. The snow swirled around her in dizzying patterns, disorienting her further. She thought of her father, probably sitting in his study now, reading his Bible by lamplight. Would he feel any remorse for what he'd done? Would he wonder where she was? Or would his pride keep him from even looking out the window? The thought brought fresh tears, which froze almost instantly on her cheeks. Her mother would have never allowed this. She would have stood up to him, would have protected her daughter with the fierce love that Mary remembered so well. But her mother was 6 years in her grave, and Mary was alone in the storm. The wind changed direction suddenly, nearly knocking her over again. Mary staggered, her frozen feet refusing to find purchase in the deep snow. She reached out blindly, hoping to find something to steady herself against, but there was nothing but the howling void of the storm. The foothills were close now. She could make out the darker shapes of rocks and trees through the curtain of snow. Somewhere up there was shelter, if only she could reach it. But each step was becoming harder, her body moving more slowly despite her desperate need to find warmth. Her thoughts were becoming scattered, dreamlike. She imagined she could hear her mother's voice calling her name, could almost see her father's study lamp glowing through the storm. But when she blinked, there was only darkness and swirling snow. The cold had become almost peaceful now, which Mary knew was dangerous. She'd heard tales of people freezing to death, how they felt warm and sleepy at the end. She fought against the urge to rest, to close her eyes for just a moment. Keep walking, she told herself, though she could barely hear her own voice over the wind. Just keep walking. Her feet moved automatically now, though she could no longer feel them. Her hands, tucked under her arms, might as well have belonged to someone else. Even the pain in her lip had faded to a distant memory, lost in the greater numbness that was claiming her body. Still, Mary Haskin walked on into the storm, each step a prayer, each breath a plea for mercy. The darkness gathered closer, and the snow continued to fall, covering her tracks almost as soon as she made them. Soon, there would be no trace of her passage, no sign to show which way she had gone. But she kept walking, because that was all she could do. She walked toward the dark shapes of the foothills, toward whatever shelter God might provide, away from the father who had cast her out and the town that had turned its back. She walked because she was her mother's daughter, and giving up had never been in her nature. The storm raged on, and Mary walked into its heart, her faith her only companion in the gathering night. The morning sun hadn't yet touched the eastern hills when 5 riders guided their horses through the deep snow. Their breath and that of their mounts clouded the crisp air as they made their way back from Widow Jensen's homestead. The successful elk hunt had lifted their spirits, and the widow's gratitude for the meat warmed them despite the biting cold. Luca Creed led the group, his experienced eyes scanning the trail ahead. Behind him, Hank Doyle's massive buffalo robe made him look like a bear on horseback, while Walt Timmons adjusted his scarf against the wind. Luke Oren rode beside the silent Ephraim Pike, whose quick gestures often said more than words could express. Reckon the widow'll make that elk last till spring, Walt said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. Never seen anybody stretch provisions like that woman. Hank nodded, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. She's got wisdom from both sides of the ocean. My mother's people could have learned a thing or two from her about preserving meat. Your mother's people knew plenty, Luke reminded him quietly. Different ways is all. The crunch of snow beneath their horses' hooves created a steady rhythm as they approached the bridge spanning the frozen river. The water below was mostly ice now, with only a thin channel of black water still flowing beneath its surface. Luca pulled his horse to a sudden stop, raising his hand to halt the others. His keen eyes had caught something, a dark shape against the white snow near the riverbank. At first he thought it might be a fallen deer, but something about its form made his heart skip a beat. "There's someone down there," he said, already turning his horse toward the bank. The others followed without hesitation, their mounts carefully picking their way down the slope. As they drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a human figure, half buried in snow. Luca dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, rushing forward through the knee-deep drifts. It was a young woman, her dress thin against the brutal cold, her face partially hidden by her snow-dusted hair. "She's still breathing," Luca announced, his voice tight with urgency. "But barely." Hank was already shrugging off his massive buffalo robe, while Ephraim quickly gathered dry kindling from beneath the protection of the evergreens. Luke and Walt secured the horses, then joined Luca beside the unconscious woman. "Mary Haskin," Walt said softly, recognition dawning on his face. "The preacher's daughter." Luca gently brushed the snow from her face, revealing a split lip and the beginning of a bruise. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "She's near frozen. We need to warm her up slow and careful." Ephraim had already started a small fire in the shelter of the trees, his skilled hands working quickly despite the cold. The flames caught and grew, providing a small circle of warmth against the morning chill. Hank and Luca carefully lifted Mary, wrapped in the buffalo robe, and carried her closer to the fire's warmth. The mute trapper reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small flask. With practiced movements, he mixed snow with a small amount of whiskey, creating a solution that would help warm her from the inside, without shocking her system. He gestured to Luca, who understood and carefully supported Mary's head, while Ephraim administered the mixture drop by drop to her blue-tinged lips. "The Reverend did this," Luke said quietly, his eyes on Mary's bruised face. It wasn't a question. Walt's usually cheerful expression had turned hard. "Whole town knows his temper. Nobody does anything about it, though. Man of God and all that." "Some man of God," Hank muttered, adjusting the buffalo robe to better protect Mary from the wind. His large hands, capable of bending iron at his forge, were surprisingly gentle. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold when Mary stirred slightly. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. The men watched anxiously as Ephraim prepared another small dose of his warming mixture. "She won't last long out here," Luca said, his voice low but firm. "Even with the fire." "Can't take her back to town," Luke responded, his hand unconsciously moving to the cross he wore beneath his coat. "Not to him." The wind howled through the trees, as if emphasizing the urgency of their situation. The men exchanged looks, a silent communication born of years working and surviving together in the wilderness. "Our cabin," Hank suggested, voicing what they were all thinking. "It's well stocked, warm, far enough from town that no one would think to look there." Ephraim nodded emphatically, his hands moving in quick gestures that the others had learned to read over the years. He pointed to Mary, then made a series of signs indicating shelter and safety. "It's settled then," Luca said, looking at each of his companions in turn. "We take her to the high cabin." The decision made, they moved with practiced efficiency. The fire was carefully extinguished, leaving no trace. Luke and Walt prepared the horses, while Hank and Luca gently lifted Mary. Ephraim had already mounted his horse, ready to guide them along the safest path up into the hills. "Safest way is to have her ride with Hank," Luca decided. "That buffalo robe of his and his size will keep her warmest." With utmost care, they settled Mary in front of Hank on his horse. The blacksmith cradled her securely with one arm while holding the reins with the other. The buffalo robe enveloped them both, creating a shelter against the bitter wind. As they began their careful ascent into the hills, the wind grew stronger, whipping snow into their faces and trying to force them back. But none of the men wavered. They had made their choice, and they would see it through. Walt led the way now, his knowledge of the terrain guiding them along the safest path. Ephraim rode beside Hank, his experienced eyes constantly checking on their unconscious charge. Luke and Luca brought up the rear, alert for any sign of pursuit, though they knew it was unlikely anyone from town would venture out in such weather. The morning light revealed more of Mary's condition as they rode. Her face was pale as new snow, except for the darkening bruise on her cheek and the split in her lip. Her hands, tucked beneath the buffalo robe, were blue with cold. Now and then she would shiver violently, which the men knew was actually a good sign. Her body was fighting to warm itself. "My mother always said God works in mysterious ways," Hank said softly, adjusting his hold on Mary as they navigated a particularly steep section. "Reckon finding her was no accident." "Reckon not," Luke agreed, his quiet voice nearly lost in the wind. The high cabin was still a good hour's ride away, but none of the men complained about the difficulty of the journey. Each of them had known hardship, had faced their own demons and struggles. Perhaps that's why they had found each other, formed this unlikely brotherhood in the wilderness. Now they had been called to help someone else in need, and they would not fail in that duty. The wind might howl like judgment, the path might be treacherous, but their course was set. They would take Mary to safety, protect her from both the cold and those who had hurt her. As they rode higher into the hills, the storm began to ease, as if nature itself approved of their mission. The sun broke through the clouds occasionally, sending brilliant shafts of light across the snow-covered landscape. In one such moment of brightness, Mary stirred again, her head turning slightly against Hank's chest. Ephraim immediately signaled for a brief stop, pulling out his flask once more. This time when he administered the warming mixture, Mary's lips moved slightly, accepting the liquid more readily. The men exchanged hopeful looks before continuing their journey. The trail grew steeper, winding through stands of pine and aspen. The horses moved carefully, their hooves finding secure footing despite the deep snow. Each step took them further from the town below, from the violence and judgment that had driven Mary into the storm. Walt began humming softly, an old hymn that seemed appropriate for their journey. Luke joined in after a moment, and even Hank added his deep voice to the melody. Ephraim kept time with gentle movements of his hand, while Luca listened, his thoughts on the young woman they were trying to save. The morning grew brighter as they climbed, the storm falling behind them like a discarded memory. Ahead lay the high cabin, with its solid walls and warm hearth. There they could tend to Mary properly, give her time to heal in body and spirit. The wind still howled through the trees, but its voice had changed from judgment to something else. Perhaps a prayer, or maybe a promise. The 5 men rode on, their determination unshaken, carrying their precious burden toward safety and, though they didn't know it yet, toward redemption. The mountain cabin emerged from the swirling snow like a promise of shelter. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, signaling that the fire they'd banked before leaving still lived. Luca dismounted first, trudging through knee-deep snow to unlock the heavy wooden door. The familiar scent of pine smoke and yesterday's venison stew welcomed them home. "Bring her in careful now," Luca called out, stoking the fire to full life. Warmth began to push back the morning chill. Hank cradled Mary like she was made of spun glass, while Luke and Walt rushed ahead to clear space on Luke's bunk. The rough-hewn bed sat furthest from the door, where drafts couldn't reach. Ephraim was already at the cook fire, preparing broth from their stores. The single room was simple, but solid. Log walls chinked with moss and clay, plank floor swept clean, window shutters sealed tight against the storm. Rifles hung on pegs, alongside strings of dried herbs and meat. A black cookstove squatted in one corner, while the stone fireplace dominated the opposite wall. 5 bunks lined up against the back wall, each with its own wool blanket and buffalo robe. They settled Mary onto Luke's bunk, piling blankets around her still form. Her face remained pale as milk, except for the purple bruise blooming on her cheek. The split in her lip had begun to swell. "She's starting to warm some," Hank reported, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he tucked the blankets closer. A soft whimper escaped Mary's lips. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear flooding her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings and the 5 bearded men hovering nearby. She tried to shrink deeper into the blankets. Walt stepped forward, keeping his voice soft and calm. "Don't be frightened, miss. We found you by the river, nearly frozen. Brought you here to warm up and heal. We mean no harm, only rescue." Mary's eyes darted between the men, searching for truth in their faces. Ephraim approached slowly, a cup of warm broth in his hands. He nodded encouragingly, extending the cup. "Just a little broth to start," Walt explained. "Ephraim here makes the best trail soup this side of the divide." With trembling hands, Mary tried to take the cup, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. Without a word, Walt sat on the edge of the bunk and helped her sip the warm liquid, 1 spoonful at a time. The other men busied themselves around the cabin, giving her space while keeping watch from the corners of their eyes. After a few spoonfuls, Mary's eyes grew heavy again. Walt eased her back against the pillow, adding another wool blanket for good measure. Within moments, she had drifted back to sleep. "She needs rest more than anything now," Luke said quietly, studying her face with concern. "That and time to heal." The day passed slowly as the storm raged outside. The men moved quietly around the cabin, tending the fire, preparing food, and checking on their unexpected guest. They spoke in low voices, sharing worried glances when Mary tossed in her sleep or whimpered at some dream terror. As night fell, the wind grew stronger, rattling the shutters and howling down the chimney. Mary stirred again, this time coming fully awake. She kept her eyes closed at first, listening to the quiet movements around her. Then she heard something unexpected. Prayer. 5 rough voices, softened with gratitude, thanked God for guiding them to find her in time. They asked for healing for her hurts, both seen and unseen. Their simple words carried more genuine faith than all her father's thundering sermons. "Lord, we thank you for leading us to her." Walt's voice rose slightly above the others. "You know what she needs better than we do. Give us wisdom to help her heal." "Amen," the others murmured in unison. Mary opened her eyes, finding the men gathered near the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on their weathered faces. These weren't the kinds of men who usually came to her father's church. They were trappers, hunters, mountain men. yet there was a reverence in their postures that spoke of genuine faith. Luca noticed her watching and stood slowly, keeping his movements careful and non-threatening. "There's space by the fire if you'd like to warm yourself proper, miss. You've been sleeping most of the day." Mary hesitated, clutching the blankets closer. "You're safe here," Luca continued softly. "You got our word on that. No one's going to hurt you." The sincerity in his voice reached something deep inside her. Slowly, Mary nodded, though she still didn't speak. Walt and Luke helped her up, supporting her when her legs trembled. They settled her in a chair near the fire, wrapping her in blankets again. Ephraim brought her another cup of broth, warmed with bits of venison this time. Her hands were steadier now, and she managed to hold the cup herself. The warm liquid spread through her chest like a blessing. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, the atmosphere remained calm and peaceful. The men went about their evening tasks, cleaning rifles, mending gear, writing in journals. Now and then, one would add wood to the fire or offer Mary more broth. They didn't press her to talk, letting her observe them in silence. Through the next day, the storm showed no sign of weakening. Snow piled higher around the cabin, and the wind found new voices to howl with. But inside, Mary began to notice things she'd missed before. How Ephraim's hands moved in graceful patterns to speak. How Walt could quote scripture as easily as trail signs. How Luke hummed hymns while he worked. She watched Hank's massive hands carefully repair a torn shirt, his stitches tiny and even. She saw how they all moved around each other with the ease of long friendship, anticipating needs before they were spoken. These men might look rough, might live far from town and church, but there was a gentleness in them that showed in 100 small ways. By the evening of the second day, Mary had gathered enough courage to whisper "thank you" when Luke brought her a plate of stew. The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. That night, as the storm began to ease at last, Mary lay awake on Luke's bunk, listening to the men's quiet breathing. Her father had always preached about God's judgment, about the wickedness of men's hearts. But here, in this simple cabin with these 5 strangers, she'd found more Christian charity than she'd ever known in her father's house. Her cheek still ached where he'd struck her, but something else was healing. Something deeper than bruises. These men, with their rough hands and gentle hearts, had shown her that not all strength was cruel, that not all men were like her father. They had given her safety, warmth, and respect, expecting nothing in return. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the sleeping forms of her rescuers. Mary offered up her own quiet prayer of thanks, her heart beginning to believe that perhaps God's mercy could reach even here, even her. Outside, the storm's voice finally began to soften, its fury spent at last. Inside the cabin, Mary pulled the blankets closer and let herself relax into their warmth. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly safe. Down in Silverton, morning sunlight glinted off fresh snow, but the peaceful scene belied the storm of gossip brewing in the town's streets and shops. The general store buzzed like a disturbed beehive as women gathered to exchange whispered theories about Mary Haskin's disappearance. "Heard tell she was seen with them mountain men," Mrs. Peterson murmured behind her hand. "5 of them, rough as bear hide." Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, clutched her shawl tighter. "Poor thing. After what her father did, throwing her out like that. In this weather, no less." "Maybe she ran off with them willing," another woman suggested, earning sharp looks from the others. "Well, wouldn't you, living with the Reverend's temper?" The bell above the store's door jangled as Reverend Abel Haskin himself burst in, his face red with rage and his collar askew. The women scattered like startled chickens, pretending sudden interest in dry goods and pickle barrels. "Mountain devils!" he thundered, slamming his fist on the counter. "They've taken my daughter, my own flesh and blood carried off by those godless heathens." The storekeeper, Tom Wilson, set down his ledger carefully. "Now, Reverend, those men ain't devils. They trade fair and—" "Silence." Haskins' voice cracked like a whip. "You'll see. I'll raise the law and the Lord against them. They'll burn for this transgression." He stormed out, leaving the door swinging wildly. Through the window, people watched him stride toward the telegraph office, his black coat billowing in the wind. Inside the telegraph office, young Jimmy Peters' fingers trembled as the Reverend dictated messages to the territorial marshal and neighboring towns. The preacher's words painted a dark tale of kidnapping and corruption, though Jimmy had seen Mary's bruised face himself that night. "Send it now, boy," Haskin commanded, "and mark it urgent." The telegraph key clicked and clattered, spreading the Reverend's version of events across the wire. Jimmy glanced uneasily at the mounting snow on the windowsill, wondering if any lawman could even reach the high country in this weather. Across town, Widow Clara Jensen stood in her doorway, watching the Reverend's progress with sharp eyes. When Mrs. Peterson and her friends stopped by to share the latest rumors, the widow's weathered face hardened. "Those men you're so quick to condemn?" she said, her Norwegian accent thick with emotion. "They've brought me firewood every winter since my Jacob passed, split and stacked it proper, never taking a penny. Luca Creed himself carried me through 3 feet of snow when I broke my ankle." "But surely 5 rough men and 1 young woman," Mrs. Peterson began. "Shame on you," Clara cut her off. "Those men have more honor than half this town. Mary's safer with them than she was under her father's roof, and well you know it." The women departed, chastened but unconvinced. Clara watched them go, then turned to check her herb stores. She had a feeling they'd be needed soon enough. Sheriff Roy Heller sat in his office, turning his coffee cup in circles on his desk. The Reverend's accusations warred with what he knew of the mountain men. They'd never caused trouble, always paid their debts, helped folks when needed. But a preacher's daughter. "Take a ride up there, Will," he told his deputy, "just to check the story. But mind you don't start anything. Weather's too fierce for foolishness." Deputy Will Collins nodded, though his face showed his reluctance. The path to the high cabin was treacherous in good weather. In winter, it could be deadly. As Collins saddled his horse, the first rocks began to slide. Small ones at first, then larger, brought down by the weight of fresh snow. He made it halfway up the ridge before a major slide blocked the trail completely. Turning back, he noticed fresh avalanche signs on several slopes. "No getting through for at least a week," he reported to the sheriff. "Maybe more, if it keeps snowing." Sheriff Heller nodded, relief and worry warring in his expression. A week might cool tempers, or it might heat them to explosive levels. Up in the mountain cabin, Mary sat wrapped in a quilt near the fire, watching Luca sharpen his hunting knife. The steady scrape of stone on steel had become oddly comforting over the past few days. She held a tin cup of coffee between her palms, savoring its warmth. "Never had coffee before," she'd admitted that morning when Hank offered her a cup. "Father said it was sinful." The men had exchanged glances but said nothing. Now she sipped it carefully, learning to appreciate its bitter warmth. A ghost of a smile touched her lips as she watched Luca work. His movements were precise, methodical. Nothing like her father's aggressive gestures or sudden movements. None of the men moved that way. They all seemed to understand her flinching, her silence, giving her space, while ensuring she knew she wasn't alone. Ephraim taught her to speak with her hands, simple signs at first. "Thank you, please, yes, no." His silent patience made the learning easier. Walt shared stories from his worn Bible, stories of mercy and healing she'd never heard her father preach. Hank kept her cup filled with broth or coffee, never commenting when her hands shook. And Luke was different. He moved through the cabin like shadow and sunlight, quiet but present. When he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes followed her with a gentleness that made her heart flutter strangely. But he never came too close, never pressed for words she wasn't ready to give. "Reckon you might want to learn this," Luca said suddenly, breaking into her thoughts. He held out the whetstone. "Useful skill, keeping a blade sharp." Mary hesitated only a moment before setting down her cup and accepting the stone. Luca showed her the proper angle, the steady pressure needed. The repetitive motion was soothing, like prayer beads through fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, the words coming easier now. Luca nodded, understanding she meant more than just the lesson. "You're welcome here as long as you need, Miss Mary. We all agree on that." Outside, the wind howled its agreement, while inside, the fire crackled, and 5 men went about their evening tasks, careful to keep their movements measured, their voices low. Mary worked the whetstone, finding rhythm in its song, feeling safer with each passing hour. Luke watched her from his place by the window, where he was mending a snowshoe. Her hands were small on the whetstone, but steady now. The bruise on her cheek was fading to yellow, though the memory of it still made his jaw clench. She looked up, caught his gaze, and didn't look away immediately. "Progress," he thought, careful to keep his expression gentle. In town, the rumors continued to swirl like snowflakes in a storm. Some women left plates of food on Widow Jensen's step, silent support for her defense of the mountain men. Others crossed the street when they saw her coming, whispering about foreign notions and impropriety. The telegraph office remained busy as Reverend Haskins sent daily messages demanding action. Jimmy Peters passed these messages along, but added his own private note to each. "Trails impassable. No action possible until thaw." Sheriff Heller kept the peace as best he could, listening to all sides but committing to none. He remembered Mary's face that night, remembered too how the mountain men had helped search for lost children last spring, how they'd fought the mine fire alongside everyone else. "Ain't always what seems proper, that's right," he told his deputy. "Sometimes mercy wears rough clothes." The snow continued to fall, softly now, building drifts that separated town from mountain as surely as fear separates truth from tale. In the high cabin, Mary learned to smile again, while below, Silverton held its breath, waiting to see what the thaw would bring. Widow Jensen stood at her window each evening, watching the mountain silhouette against the darkening sky. She smiled when she saw smoke rising from where she knew the cabin stood, knowing that up there, healing was taking place far from the town's judgmental eyes. "Let them talk," she murmured to herself, setting water to boil for tea. "Truth's stronger than gossip if you give it time." The fire in the mountain cabin burned steady and warm, while 5 rough men moved quietly around a wounded young woman, showing her through 100 small kindnesses that not all strength leaves bruises, and not all shelter has walls. The mountain cabin settled into a gentle rhythm as February's harsh grip began to soften. Morning light filtered through frost-rimmed windows, casting long shadows across rough-hewn floorboards. The men moved through their daily tasks with quiet purpose, while Mary slowly found her place among them. One crisp morning, Hank sat at the wooden table, working leather with practiced hands. Mary watched from her place by the fire, fascinated by the way his fingers moved surely over the worn boot he was mending. "Want to learn?" he asked, noticing her interest. His voice was gentle, careful not to startle. Mary nodded, rising slowly from her seat. She approached the table like a cautious deer, but her eyes showed eager interest. Hank pulled out the bench beside him, giving her plenty of space. First thing about leather, he explained, laying out his tools, is understanding how it wants to move. Like people, it's got its own nature. He demonstrated the basic stitching pattern, his large hands surprisingly delicate with the awl and waxed thread. Mary watched intently, her shoulders gradually relaxing as he talked about different kinds of leather, proper needle spacing, and the importance of careful knots. "Your turn," he said, offering her a damaged boot and fresh thread. "Don't worry about making mistakes. Leather's forgiving if you treat it right." Her first attempts were clumsy, but Hank showed infinite patience. When she finally completed a neat row of stitches, her face lit up with quiet pride. Hank nodded approvingly, understanding this was about more than mending boots. "You've got steady hands," he said. "That's good. Steady hands tell true stories." Later that week, Ephraim took Mary outside on a clear morning. Fresh snow blanketed the ground, but the air held hints of coming thaw. He carried several lengths of wire and twine, his weathered face peaceful in the winter light. Through gestures and gentle guidance, he showed her how to set a rabbit snare. His hands moved with practiced grace, demonstrating the proper height, the careful loop, the secure anchor. Mary watched closely, mimicking his movements until she could set one properly. When she successfully completed her first snare, Ephraim's face creased in a warm smile. He bowed slightly, acknowledging her achievement. Mary returned the gesture with a shy smile of her own, understanding that some teachings need no words. Back inside, Walt brought out the family Bible after supper. Its leather cover was worn smooth by generations of hands, its pages soft with use. He opened it carefully, finding his place by lamplight. "My father used to read every evening," he said, his voice holding old memories. "Reckon some habits stick, even when we try to leave them behind." He began reading from Psalms, his deep voice filling the cabin with ancient words of comfort. To everyone's surprise, Mary's voice joined his, quiet but clear on familiar verses. Her voice trembled at first, like autumn leaves in wind, but grew stronger as Walt smiled encouragement. Luca sat in shadows by the fire, listening. The words stirred something deep within him, memories of childhood faith, of prayers spoken before battle, of doubt in blood-soaked fields. He watched Mary's face in the flickering light, saw peace there that he'd long forgotten how to feel. Days passed this way, marked by small victories and quiet healing. Mary's laugh emerged one morning over breakfast, when Walt told a gentle story about a stubborn mule. The sound startled her as much as anyone, rusty and hesitant, like a long unused door opening. But it was real, and it brought answering smiles to weather-worn faces. Outside, winter's grip began to loosen. Icicles dripped steady rhythms from the eaves, and patches of dark earth emerged through thinning snow. The men watched these signs with mixed feelings, knowing the thaw would bring decisions none were ready to face. One evening, as they sat around the fire after supper, Mary spoke up. Her voice was soft but steady. Would you tell me about yourselves? About what brought you here?" The request hung in the fire-lit air. The men exchanged glances, weighing old hurts against new trust. Finally, Walt nodded slowly. "Reckon you've earned the right to know," he said, "though they ain't pretty tales." Luca spoke first, his eyes on the flames. "I was a Union scout during the war. Had 20 men under my command. Good men. Got orders to hold a bridge. Suicide mission, we all knew it. His voice caught. "I left my post. Led them away instead of to their deaths. Military calls that desertion. I call it living with ghosts." Mary's eyes held tears, but no judgment. You chose mercy, she whispered. Hank's turn came next. His strong hands worked a piece of leather as he spoke. My mother was Cherokee. Father was Irish. Neither side wanted me fully. Grew up angry at everyone. Whites for their prejudice, tribe for turning us away during removal. Took years to learn that bitterness poisons the vessel that holds it. But you learned, Mary said softly. Hank nodded, something easing in his expression. Walt's laugh held no humor. I was meant for the pulpit, like my father. Studied scripture, learned Greek. Then I saw him beat my mother one too many times, all while preaching about divine love. Left, home at 16, carrying more anger than faith. Been trying to sort out the difference ever since. Mary reached out, touched his hand briefly. You read with kindness, she said. That's worth something. Ephraim couldn't speak his story, but his hands moved in shapes they'd all learned to read. He told of a house fire, of saving a child but losing his voice to smoke, of a wife and daughters taken by fever the next winter, of finding peace in silence and purpose in helping others. Mary wept openly now, tears tracking silver down her cheeks. God hasn't abandoned any of you, she said, voice thick with emotion. You can still feel sorrow. That means your hearts are alive. And where there's life, there's hope for healing. The men sat quietly, letting her words sink deep. Outside, an owl called softly through the darkness. Inside, something shifted like ice breaking up on a spring river. What about you? Luca asked gently. What's in your heart? Mary stared into the fire for a long moment. I'm learning, she said finally, that God's love doesn't leave bruises. That mercy can wear rough clothes and speak with quiet voices. That maybe... She paused, gathering courage. Maybe I'm worth more than I was taught to believe. Ephraim reached out slowly, offering a small wooden cross he'd carved. Mary accepted it with trembling hands, running her fingers over its smooth surface. Thank you, she whispered, looking at each man in turn, for showing me what true Christian charity looks like. Walt cleared his throat gruffly. Reckon we're all learning from each other, he said. The fire crackled softly, throwing warm light on faces that had grown familiar and dear. Outside, the snow continued its slow surrender to spring, but inside the cabin, something stronger than winter's grip had already begun to thaw. They sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in thought but bound by understanding. Mary's fingers traced the wooden cross, feeling its smooth edges, its solid weight. It was different from the gilt crosses in her father's church. Simpler, more real somehow. Like the men who had taken her in, it held truth in its rough beauty. Hank added another log to the fire, its pop and spark punctuating the quiet. Ephraim's hands moved in a gentle blessing, and Mary found herself smiling through her tears. These men, with their broken paths and healing hearts, had taught her more about God's love than all her father's thundering sermons. The night deepened around the cabin, stars pricking through clearing skies. Inside, 6 souls breathed easier, unburdened by shared confession, strengthened by mutual understanding. Mary's quiet presence had become their center, her compassion a mirror showing each their own worth. Luca watched her from his corner, seeing how she'd changed from the frightened girl they'd found in the snow. Her spine was straighter now, her eyes clearer. She moved with growing confidence, though still gentle as a dove. Something pulled tight in his chest. Pride, perhaps, or something deeper he wasn't ready to name. The fire burned low, but none moved to bank it yet. This moment felt sacred somehow, like a church built of honesty and trust rather than timber and nails. Mary's words about God not abandoning them echoed in the comfortable silence, settling into hungry hearts like seeds in spring soil. The mountain trail twisted like a frozen snake through the evergreens, testing both horse and rider. Deputy Marshal Wilson cursed softly as his mount picked its way across ice-slicked rocks. He'd been climbing since dawn, following rumors and half-drawn maps toward the trapper's cabin. The February sun hung low and cold in the afternoon sky when they reached the stream crossing. Ice crusted the banks, deceptively thick near the edges but thin over the rushing water. Wilson dismounted, leading his horse carefully by the reins. "Easy there, Solomon," he murmured, patting the gelding's neck. "Nice and slow." They were halfway across when Solomon's hoof broke through the ice. The horse reared, panicked, and came down hard on the slippery rocks. A sharp crack echoed through the canyon, followed by the animal's pained whinny. Wilson's heart sank as he saw Solomon favoring his right foreleg. No break. Thank heaven for small mercies. But the sprain was bad enough. The deputy knew his investigation would have to wait. "Looks like we're making camp, old friend," he said, leading Solomon to a sheltered spot beneath towering pines. As darkness fell, Wilson built a small fire and wrapped himself in wool blankets. He couldn't shake the feeling that this delay might matter more than he knew. When morning broke crisp and clear, he paid a passing fur trader heading to town to carry word to the sheriff. "Tell him the trail's dangerous," Wilson instructed, pressing coins into the man's gloved hand. "The cabin will be investigated once conditions improve, but it might take time." The trader nodded, tucking the message and money into his coat. "Weather's turning again," he warned, glancing at gathering clouds. "Best keep that horse warm tonight." Back at the cabin, Luca stood on the porch, scanning the ridge line with worried eyes. Years of scouting had taught him to read signs others missed: broken branches, disturbed snow, the altered flight patterns of birds. Something was coming. Inside, he found the others gathered around the table, Mary pouring coffee into tin cups. She looked stronger now. Color returned to her cheeks, though shadows still lingered in her eyes. "Reckon it's time we talked about going down to town," Luca said quietly, accepting a cup from Mary's steady hands. "Clear up these stories before they grow wilder." Walt nodded slowly. "Folk get strange ideas when left to wonder too long, especially about mountain folk like us." "I'm strong enough now," Mary said, her voice soft but determined, "and I need to face him, face them all. But first—" She disappeared into the back room, returning with paper and a worn pencil. The men watched in respectful silence as she wrote, her small, neat letters filling the page. Tears fell occasionally, making dark spots on the paper, but she didn't stop until she'd finished. "It's for my father," she explained, folding the letter carefully. "I forgive him. Not because he deserves it, but because I need to let go of the hurt. I'm asking for peace, if he'll hear it." Luke cleared his throat. "I could take it down to him," he offered. "Might listen better coming from another man." Mary looked up, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Would you? I know it's asking much." "Ain't asking too much at all," Luke replied, his voice gentle. "Man ought to hear his daughter's heart, even if he's forgotten how to listen proper." Ephraim's hands moved in their silent language, and Hank translated. "Says we should all go together, safer that way." "Tomorrow then," Luca decided. "We'll need supplies for the journey." The next morning dawned clear and cold. The men worked steadily, chopping wood for those who'd stay behind, packing provisions for the descent. Mary helped where she could, wrapping bread and dried meat in clean cloth, filling canteens with fresh water. Above them, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily in the pale winter sky. Walt paused in his work, watching it soar. My grandmother used to say hawks bring messages of change, he said thoughtfully. Reckon she knew something about that. As if in answer, the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the heavy flakes of storm, but fine and quiet, like powdered sugar sifting through the air. The men worked faster, knowing how quickly mountain weather could turn. That evening, they gathered close around the fire. Without discussion or ceremony, they joined hands. Mary between Luca and Luke, then Walt, Hank, and Ephraim completing the circle. Lord, Walt began, his deep voice reverent, we ain't always been faithful servants, but we ask your blessing now. Watch over our journey. Help us speak truth to those who've heard lies. And if it be your will, bring peace where there's been strife. Amen, the others murmured, except for Ephraim, who squeezed Mary's hand in silent agreement. Mary's voice rose next, trembling at first but growing stronger. Thank you, Lord, for sending these good men to save me, not just my life, but my faith too. Help me show my father that your love is bigger than his anger. And please, she paused, gathering courage. Please help him find the healing he needs. Amen, they echoed, and this time Ephraim's free hand moved in his gesture for truth. One by one, the others added their prayers. Hank asked for wisdom and clear paths. Luke prayed for gentle words and open hearts. Ephraim's hands shaped prayers for protection and understanding. When Luca's turn came, he was silent for a long moment. Lord, he finally said, voice rough with emotion, we've all carried burdens of shame and fear. Help us lay them down. Show us the way forward. And he glanced at Mary, something soft in his eyes. Thank you for sending us an angel of mercy, even if she came to us in the snow. Mary ducked her head, but her hand tightened on his gratefully. They stayed that way for a time, connected by touch and trust, while the snow fell softly outside. The fire crackled and sparked, throwing warm light on their joined hands, some rough with work, some scarred by war, some gentle with healing. Together they formed a circle of hope in the wilderness, stronger than the sum of their broken parts. Finally, Walt reached for the Bible with his free hand. One more thing, he said, opening to a marked page, something I've been saving. He read slowly, his voice filling the cabin with ancient words of comfort. Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers they shall not overwhelm you. Mary's quiet tears fell freely now, but she was smiling. The men's hands remained steady around hers, offering silent support. Outside, the snow continued its gentle dance, covering their tracks and woodpiles with fresh white. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the descent to town, the confrontation with her father, the judgment of neighbors. But tonight, in this cabin warmed by fire and faith, 6 souls found peace in shared prayer and purpose. Luca watched the others prepare for sleep, his scout's instincts still alert to danger, but his heart somehow lighter. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Mary caught his eye across the room and nodded slightly, as if reading his thoughts. She understood, too. Their makeshift family had become something real and precious, forged in winter's trials and strengthened by mutual trust. The fire burned low, but none moved to bank it yet. This moment felt sacred somehow, like a church built of honesty and trust, rather than timber and nails. Tomorrow would come soon enough with its demands and decisions. For now, they let the peace of shared prayer and purpose wrap around them like a warm blanket against the winter night. Luke Oren adjusted his scarf against the biting wind as he guided his horse down the mountain trail. The leather saddlebags hung heavy with pelts on one side and lighter on the other, where Mary's carefully folded letter nestled between layers of oiled cloth to keep it dry. Fresh snow from the night before crunched beneath his horse's hooves, but the sky had cleared to a crisp winter blue. He'd left before dawn, wanting to reach town while the post office was still open. The others had gathered to see him off, Mary standing slightly apart, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "Godspeed," she'd whispered, and something in her voice had made his heart tighten. Now, as Silverton's church spire came into view above the trees, Luke rehearsed his plan. Deliver the pelts first, then the letter. Simple enough. Yet his stomach knotted as he approached the town's outer buildings. He wasn't used to carrying such precious cargo, not the pelts, but the hope and trust contained in that single envelope. The trading post's bell jingled as he entered, stomping snow from his boots. Old Jim Weber looked up from his ledger, spectacles perched on his nose. "Luke Orrin," the trader nodded. "Wasn't expecting anyone from the ridge today?" "Brought those fox pelts you were asking after," Luke said, keeping his voice casual as he unwrapped the bundle. 10 of them. Prime winter coat?" Jim examined each pelt carefully, running practiced fingers through the fur. "Fine work as always. Your usual rate?" They haggled briefly, settling on a fair price. Luke pocketed the money, trying not to seem rushed as he headed for the door. "Post office still open?" he asked. "Should be. Sarah keeps longer hours since her boy's away at school." Jim paused, adjusting his spectacles. "Heard about the preacher's daughter? That business with your cabin?" Luke met his eyes steadily. "Ain't business at all, Jim. Just Christian charity in hard weather." Outside again, Luke noticed a well-dressed stranger watching him from the hotel porch. The man's clothes marked him as a city fellow, too fine for frontier wear. Something about his calculating gaze made Luke's neck prickle. The post office occupied a narrow building between the general store and the telegraph office. Sarah Miller, the postmistress, smiled warmly as Luke entered. "Why, Luke Orrin, haven't seen you since before Christmas." "Ma'am." Luke touched his hat brim. "Got a letter needs posting." He placed Mary's envelope on the counter, along with coins for postage. Sarah picked it up, noting the address. "For Reverend Haskin?" Her eyes widened slightly. "From his daughter?" "That's private business, ma'am," Luke said quietly but firmly. Sarah nodded, properly chastened. "Of course. I'll see it goes out with tomorrow's mail." What neither of them noticed was the man who had followed Luke from the hotel. Elias Pratt stood just outside the post office window, watching the exchange with keen interest. As a land agent for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, he made it his business to know everything happening in towns marked for development. And he had particular interest in Reverend Abel Haskin. Luke left the post office with lighter saddlebags but a heavier heart. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Rather than lingering in town, he bought supplies quickly and started the long ride back to the cabin. After he'd gone, Pratt entered the post office. His polished manners and silver-headed cane commanded immediate attention. "Good afternoon, madam," he smiled at Sarah. "I wonder if you might help me. I'm expecting an important document from Reverend Haskin regarding our railroad business. Has anything arrived?" "Why, no, Mr. Pratt, but—" Sarah hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. "The Reverend's daughter just sent him a letter. Through Luke Orrin from up the ridge." Pratt's eyes gleamed with interest. "Indeed? How fascinating. You know, I'm heading to the Reverend's house shortly for our meeting. I'd be happy to deliver it personally." Sarah wavered. It wasn't strictly proper, but Mr. Pratt was such an important man, and he did regular business with Reverend Haskin. "Well, I suppose that would be all right," she said finally, "since you're going there anyway." Pratt tucked the envelope into his coat pocket, tipped his hat, and stepped out into the cold afternoon. Instead of heading toward the parsonage, however, he turned down the alley beside the telegraph office. Finding a secluded spot, he carefully opened the letter with practiced fingers that had unsealed many private correspondences. As he read Mary's words, a slow smile spread across his face. This was better than he'd hoped. The girl wrote of forgiveness, of return in spring, of making peace. But more importantly, she mentioned the cabin, the mountain men, her father's violence, all the scandal that could ruin a preacher's reputation. "My dearest father," she had written, "I forgive you for that terrible night, for the years of anger, for Mother's death that wasn't your fault. The good men who found me have shown me that God's mercy is larger than human sin. When the snow melts, I pray you'll welcome me home with that same mercy." Pratt's smile turned predatory. This was perfect leverage. The Reverend had already sold the church's water rights to the railroad for a fraction of their worth, believing Pratt's lies about a charitable fund for widows and orphans. But there were still townspeople questioning the deal, if they learned their preacher had been compromised. Taking out his silver lighter, Pratt carefully burned the envelope's edges, then the corners of the letter itself. Just enough damage to make it look accidentally destroyed. He tucked the evidence into his briefcase, then stepped into the telegraph office. The operator looked up from his clicking machine. "Afternoon, Mr. Pratt. Message to send?" "Yes, to Denver headquarters." Pratt dictated smoothly. "Deeds secure, stop local opposition contained, stop proceed with water rights acquisition, stop expect no challenges, stop." The operator's key clicked out the message while Pratt watched with satisfaction. Everything was falling into place. The railroad would control not just the land, but the water that made it valuable. And one preacher's guilty conscience and lost daughter would help ensure their plan succeeded. Meanwhile, up in the mountain cabin, Mary sat by the window, watching the path Luke had taken that morning. The others tried to keep her occupied, Ephraim showing her how to stretch new snowshoe lacings, Walt reading aloud from his dog-eared Bible, Hank telling funny stories about his days as a cavalry scout. But her eyes kept returning to the trail, hoping to see Luke's return, wondering if her father would respond to her plea for reconciliation. She didn't expect immediate forgiveness. His pride was too fierce for that. But surely some word would come, some acknowledgement of her olive branch. "Stew's ready," Luca announced, stirring the pot hanging over the fire. "Best eat while it's hot." Mary turned from the window reluctantly. "I hope Luke made it to town safely." "He knows these trails better than most," Hank reassured her. "Probably already headed back." Indeed, Luke was making his way up the mountain, though the going was slower now. Fresh snow had filled his morning tracks, and gathering clouds threatened more to come. His thoughts kept returning to that well-dressed stranger who'd watched him so intently. Something about the man's calculating expression nagged at him. The cabin's warm light welcomed him just as dusk was falling. Mary met him at the door, eyes questioning. "Delivered it safe to Sarah Miller herself," he assured her, stamping snow from his boots. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know it wasn't an easy thing to ask." Luke wanted to tell her about his unease, about the stranger's suspicious attention. But seeing hope shine in her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to dim it with his worries. Instead, he simply nodded and moved to warm himself by the fire. That evening passed quietly, with Ephraim teaching Mary to play checkers using carved wooden pieces, while the others mended gear and talked of spring hunting plans. No one mentioned the letter or what response it might bring, but they all felt the weight of waiting, of words sent out into the world that could bring either healing or deeper wounds. In his office at the hotel, Elias Pratt sat at his desk, studying Mary's damaged letter by lamplight. Such a simple thing. Paper, ink, a daughter's heart poured out to her father. Yet in his hands, it became a weapon, another piece in the railroad's great game of acquisition and control. He pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time. The evening train would be arriving soon, bringing more instructions from Denver. Soon, very soon, all of Silverton's water rights would belong to the railroad, and neither a guilty preacher nor his forgiving daughter would stand in the way. Pratt carefully locked the letter in his desk drawer, then stood to put on his coat. The dining room would be serving supper soon, and he had a sudden appetite for roast beef and victory. Back in the cabin, Mary finally left her window-watching post and joined the others around the fire. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For tonight, she had shelter, warmth, and unlikely friends who had become something like family. "Your move," Ephraim signed, gesturing at the checkerboard between them. Mary studied the pieces, then made her choice. Sometimes, she reflected, the best move was simply to keep playing the game before you, even while waiting for word from home that might never come. Outside, snow began falling again, covering Luke's tracks just as it had covered hers that first desperate night. But now, unlike then, she was surrounded by warmth and care, protected by men who asked nothing in return except trust. She said a silent prayer of thanks, unaware that her written words of forgiveness lay locked in a hotel desk drawer, their power turned to poison by a stranger's greed. The evening deepened into night. In town, Pratt reviewed his schemes over brandy and cigars. In the parsonage, Reverend Haskin paced his study, torn between pride and longing for his daughter. And in the mountain cabin, 6 souls found peace in simple things: warm food, honest work, and the quiet faith that tomorrow might bring better things than today had held. The mountain streams sang with melting snow, their waters running thick and brown with spring mud. 2 weeks had passed since Luke delivered Mary's letter, and winter's grip was finally loosening. Patches of bare ground emerged between shrinking snowdrifts, and the morning air carried the fresh scent of wet earth and new grass. Inside the cabin, Mary folded dried linens while watching the men prepare for their descent to town. Hank and Walt wrapped carefully measured portions of elk meat in oilcloth, tying them with twine. Ephraim methodically checked their ammunition supplies, his practiced hands moving with quiet efficiency. Luke cleaned their rifles at the rough-hewn table, though they all prayed they wouldn't need them. Luca stood by the window, his weathered face troubled as he studied the muddy trail below. "Town ain't gonna welcome us with open arms," he said softly. "Might be better to wait another month, let tempers cool." Mary set down her folding and crossed to stand beside him. Her face, once drawn with fear, now held quiet determination. "The longer we wait, the stronger the lies grow," she said. "Truth can't hide forever under snow or shadow." "Ain't about hiding," Luca answered, turning to face her. "It's about keeping you safe. Your father's had weeks to spin his tale. Folks will believe what they want to believe. Then we'll show them something better to believe in." Mary touched his arm gently. "You taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared." A hint of a smile touched Luca's eyes. This wasn't the trembling girl they'd found in the snow. She'd grown stronger here, like a winter-blooming flower finding light through frost. "She's right," Walt spoke up from his place by the fire. "Can't let false witness stand. Goes against everything we believe in." Hank nodded, tying off another package of meat. "Besides, we're running low on supplies. Need to make a proper trading run soon anyway." They spent the morning loading pack horses and securing the cabin. Mary wrapped her few belongings in a blanket, some borrowed clothes, a small Bible Walt had given her, and the checkers set Ephraim had carved during long winter evenings. Everything else she needed rode in her heart: courage, truth, and the love of these men who'd become her family. The sun stood high when they finally mounted up. Mary rode double with Luke, her borrowed skirts arranged modestly despite the awkward perch. They followed the stream's winding course down through stands of pine and aspen. The horses picked their way carefully over ground, still soft with melt. Near midday, they reached the wider trail where it crossed Widow Jensen's property. The old woman stood waiting by her fence, as if she'd known they were coming. Her silver hair gleamed in the spring sunshine, and her eyes held both welcome and warning. "Been expecting you," she called as they drew near. "Best stop a spell. Got news you need to hear." They dismounted in her yard, where chickens scratched at the muddy earth and early crocuses pushed through the remaining snow. Inside her snug cabin, she poured coffee into tin cups and spoke plainly. "Your father's been busy, Mary girl. He's sworn out warrants against these men, claiming kidnapping and worse. Sheriff's holding them for now, knowing better than to believe such nonsense, but he can't ignore them forever." Mary's hands tightened around her cup. "Did my letter not reach him?" "Haven't heard of any letter," the widow replied. "But I've heard plenty else. Railroad man's been thick as thieves with your father these past weeks. Something's not right there." Luca exchanged glances with his companions. They'd all noticed the railroad's growing presence in town, the way good grazing land was being marked off with surveys and stakes. "There's more," Widow Jensen continued. "Church meeting called for tomorrow. Talk of voting whether to keep your father as preacher, what with all this scandal. Town split right down the middle." "Then we're riding straight into trouble," Luke said quietly. Mary set down her cup, her face pale but determined. "All the more reason to go. I won't let innocent men suffer for helping me." The widow reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You've grown strong, child. Your mama would be proud." They stayed only long enough to rest the horses and receive the widow's blessing. As they prepared to leave, she pressed a paper-wrapped package into Mary's hands. "Fresh bread and honey," she said. "Sometimes sweetness helps the bitter go down easier." The afternoon sun was already sliding toward the mountains when they made camp beside the river. They chose a sheltered spot where willows screened them from the trail, though they kept no fire. The night air held spring's promise, warm enough to sleep under blankets and stars. After their simple supper of bread and dried meat, Walt took out his Bible. Its leather cover was smooth from years of handling, its pages dog-eared with use. He began to read in his deep, gentle voice, and soon the others joined in familiar hymns. Mary's clear soprano lifted Amazing Grace into the darkening sky, followed by What a Friend We Have in Jesus. Even Ephraim, who couldn't speak, tapped the rhythm on his knee. Their voices blended with the river's song, a harmony of praise and peace, despite tomorrow's uncertainty. During a quiet moment between songs, Luca moved to sit beside Mary. "Something my pa used to say," he offered softly. "Sometimes faith means riding toward trouble, not away from it." She nodded, understanding. "Like Daniel walking into the lion's den?" "Exactly so. He didn't know how it would end, but he knew who held the ending." They sang a few more hymns before settling down to sleep. Mary lay awake for a while, watching stars appear between the willow branches. Tomorrow they would face the town, face her father, face whatever truth or tragedy awaited them. But tonight, she was surrounded by friendship and faith, wrapped in the peace that passes understanding. Dawn came with pearl-gray light and the call of meadowlarks. They ate a cold breakfast, loaded the horses, and began the final descent toward Silverton. Mary rode tall in the saddle now, her borrowed clothes dusty, but her spirit bright. Each of the men took their usual positions, Hank leading, Walt and Luke flanking, Ephraim watching their back trail, and Luca keeping close to Mary. The morning sun caught the church steeple first, then the false fronts of Main Street's buildings. Smoke rose from chimneys into the clear spring air. Everything looked just as it had the night Mary fled, yet everything had changed. As they approached the town's outskirts, Mary straightened her spine and lifted her chin. Luca noticed her hands trembling slightly on the reins, but said nothing. Her courage didn't need his words now. It had grown strong enough to stand on its own. They rode down together, faces set against whatever fear or fury awaited them. The clip-clop of hooves on packed earth became the only sound as they entered Silverton's quiet streets. It was early still. Most shops were just opening, most townspeople still at breakfast. But word of their arrival would spread fast as wildfire in summer grass. Mary knew that by noon, everyone in Silverton would face a choice between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truth. She prayed they would choose wisely. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Mary caught glimpses of faces at windows, heard the murmur of voices behind closing doors. But she kept her eyes forward, toward the church where she had once found shelter and shame in equal measure. They were home, or what had been home, for better or worse. The time for hiding was past. The time for truth had come. The spring sun stood high overhead as the small group rode into Silverton proper. The muddy main street had begun to dry, leaving shallow ruts from wagon wheels that morning. The town seemed to hold its breath as they passed. Storekeepers paused mid-sweep on their porches. Women gathered their children closer, and men stopped their conversations to watch with hard eyes. Mary sat straight-backed between her protectors, wrapped modestly in Hank's heavy blanket despite the warming day. She had insisted on returning his buffalo robe, but he'd pressed the wool blanket on her instead, muttering about proper appearances. Now she was grateful for its shelter, as hostile stares followed their progress. "Whispers travel faster than horses," Walt observed quietly, noting how news of their arrival raced ahead of them down the street. Doors opened and closed rapidly as people ducked inside to spread the word. Luca guided his horse closer to Mary's. "Remember what we discussed. Truth first to the law, then let justice work as it should." She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly on the reins. The sheriff's office stood ahead on the corner, its weathered boards and tin star a symbol of either protection or persecution. They would soon learn which. As they dismounted, Ephraim took charge of the horses, leading them to the water trough. The others formed a loose circle around Mary as they climbed the wooden steps. The boards creaked beneath their boots, sound carrying in the unnatural quiet that had fallen over the street. Sheriff Roy Heller looked up from his desk as they entered, his weathered face carefully neutral. "Figured you'd be coming in soon enough," he said, setting aside his coffee cup. "Quite a stir you've all caused." "We've come to set things straight," Luca replied evenly. He removed his hat, the others following suit. "There's been talk that needs correcting." The sheriff's deputy, young Tom Burke, shifted nervously by the gun rack, his hand never far from his holster. But Sheriff Heller raised a calming hand. "Let's hear it then. Miss Haskin, you appear to be in good health?" "I am, Sheriff." Mary spoke softly but clearly. "These men saved my life that night in the storm. They've shown nothing but kindness and respect." Heller nodded slowly, studying each face in turn. His eyes lingered on Hank's dark features and Walt's scarred hands before returning to Mary. "That's not the tale that's been told here in town. Your father—" The door burst open with a bang that made them all jump. Reverend Abel Haskin stood in the doorway, his face flushed with rage beneath his black hat. 2 church elders flanked him, and behind them pressed a crowd of onlookers. "There she is," he thundered, pointing a trembling finger at Mary. "Corrupted by these mountain devils. Sheriff, I demand you arrest these kidnappers immediately." Mary shrank back, but Luca and the others held their ground. The small office grew tighter as more townspeople tried to squeeze in, their curious faces peering around the doorframe. "Now hold on, Reverend." Sheriff Heller raised his voice above the growing murmur. "We're having a civilized discussion here." "Civilized?" Haskin spat the word. "There's nothing civilized about these heathens stealing a young girl from her Christian home. Look how they've dressed her, in men's clothes, a disgrace before God." Mary clutched Hank's blanket tighter, shame coloring her cheeks at the mention of her borrowed clothing. But then she felt Luca's steady presence beside her, saw Walt's gentle nod of encouragement. "Nobody stole anyone," Hank said firmly, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "We found her half frozen by the river that night. Would you rather we'd left her to die?" The Reverend's face darkened further. "You dare question me? A man of God?" "Sheriff, I won't stand here while these criminals—" "Enough!" Luca's command silenced the room. He turned to Sheriff Heller, his voice deliberate and calm. "Sir, let Mary speak. Let her tell what really happened that night. Surely everyone here wants the truth." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even the church elders looked expectantly at the sheriff, who nodded slowly. "That seems fair. Miss Haskin?" Mary stepped forward, though her heart pounded so hard she feared everyone could hear it. The blanket slipped slightly from her shoulders, revealing the simple men's shirt beneath, but she lifted her chin and spoke clearly. "That night, I was put out into the storm," she began, her voice gaining strength. "I walked until I couldn't feel my feet anymore. I remember praying to God for mercy before everything went dark. These men found me, carried me to safety, and nursed me back to health. They never laid a wrong hand on me, never spoke an improper word. They showed me what true Christian charity means." Several women in the crowd nodded, but Reverend Haskin's face had gone from red to purple. "Lies. Sheriff, she's clearly been addled by their influence. You demand nothing here," Sheriff Heller cut in sharply. "This is my office, Reverend, and we'll do things proper." He studied Mary's face carefully. "You say they rescued you. Why didn't they bring you straight back to town?" "The storm, sir," Walt answered before Mary could speak. "Snowed us in for days. By then," he glanced at the Reverend, choosing his words carefully. "We thought it best to wait until she was stronger." The tension in the room grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Several men had moved their hands closer to their gun belts, while women whispered prayers under their breath. Mary saw the sheriff's eyes move between her father's rage and her friend's steady calm. Finally, Heller sighed heavily. "Way I see it, we've got serious accusations here. Can't just dismiss them, not with the Reverend standing in the community, until we sort this out proper." He nodded to his deputy. "Tom, lock these men up. Gentle-like now. They came in peaceful." "No." Mary stepped forward, but Luca caught her arm. "It's all right," he said softly. "Law's got to work its course. Truth will stand." The 5 men surrendered their guns without protest, though Hank's jaw clenched tight as the deputy took his prized Colt. One by one, they were led to the cells in the back. Mary watched helplessly as the iron doors clanged shut on her protectors. "As for you, young lady," Reverend Haskin grabbed Mary's arm roughly, "you'll come back to the church where you belong. Sister Martha will help you recover your senses and your proper modesty." "Sheriff," Luca called from his cell, "you saw how she trembled when he grabbed her. Look in your heart, man." But Sheriff Heller turned away, suddenly very interested in the papers on his desk. The crowd parted as Reverend Haskin dragged Mary toward the door, her borrowed blanket falling to the floor behind her. "What about the hearing?" Walt asked. "When will that be?" "Tomorrow morning," Hella replied, without looking up. "Give everyone time to cool down and think straight." Mary cast one last desperate look at her friends before being pulled out into the street. The bright sunlight seemed to mock the darkness gathering in her heart. She saw Widow Jensen watching from across the way, concern etched on her weathered face. But even she could only stand silent as Mary was marched toward the church. Sister Martha waited on the steps, her thin face pinched with disapproval. "Come, child," she said, taking Mary's other arm. "We'll get you properly dressed and fed. Then we'll pray for your soul." Mary allowed herself to be led inside the church, past the empty pews where she had once found comfort in prayer. Now the familiar walls felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. As the heavy wooden door closed behind her, she heard her father addressing the dispersing crowd. "Let this be a lesson," he proclaimed. "Evil takes many forms, even seeming kindness, but God's justice will prevail." The words echoed in the quiet church as Sister Martha steered Mary toward the back rooms. Through a window, she caught a last glimpse of the sheriff's office, where 5 good men sat behind bars for the crime of showing Christian mercy. Mary bowed her head, but not in shame. She prayed, not for herself, but for justice to truly prevail, for hearts to be softened, for truth to break through like spring sun after winter storms. She would need all her newfound strength for what lay ahead. Sister Martha clicked her tongue at Mary's men's clothing, already laying out a proper dress and corset. "We'll soon have you looking like yourself again," she promised. But Mary knew she could never go back to who she had been before. The girl who had fled into that snowstorm had found more than physical rescue in the mountain cabin. She had found her true self, her courage, and God's real love shone through unlikely angels. Now she had to find a way to save them in return. Night crept over Silverton like a dark blanket, bringing no comfort to those behind iron bars. In the jail's back cells, 5 men sat shoulder to shoulder on a rough wooden bench. The occasional clinking of their shackles echoed against stone walls, a bitter reminder of their circumstances. Ephraim Pike's weathered hands moved steadily despite the iron around his wrists. From a small piece of pine he'd found in his pocket, his skilled fingers worked with careful determination. Wood shavings fell softly to the floor as a tiny cross began to take shape beneath his knife. Luca watched his friend work, noting how the lamplight caught the silver in Ephraim's hair. Though the mute trapper couldn't speak, his peaceful expression said more than words ever could. The steady scrape of blade against wood became almost musical in the quiet cell. "Hands hurting you any, Walt?" Hank whispered, noticing how his older friend kept flexing his fingers. Walt Timmons shook his head, though the raw skin around his wrists told a different story. "Had worse in the war," he murmured. "Just pray Mary's holding up wherever they've got her." Luke Oren leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That preacher's got the whole town stirred up something fierce. Heard them talking about building gallows while they were leading us in." "They won't hang anyone," Luca said firmly, though his own heart tightened at the thought. "Sheriff Heller's a coward, maybe, but he's no murderer. He knows we're innocent." Ephraim finished his carving and passed the small wooden cross down the bench. Each man held it briefly, drawing strength from its simple beauty before passing it along. When it reached Luca last, he studied the careful details Ephraim had somehow managed despite the shackles. Even in darkness, their friend found ways to create light. "Reckon it's time for evening prayers," Walt suggested quietly. The others nodded, and 5 heads bowed in the dim cell. Their whispered words rose together, a harmony of rough voices grown gentle with faith. Lord, watch over Mary tonight. Give her strength for what's coming. Help truth shine brighter than lies, and forgive those who'd harm us, for they know not what they do. Across town, in the parsonage's narrow guest room, Mary knelt beside a hard bed. Her father had ordered 2 church elders to guard her door, for her own protection. Their shadows moved beneath the door crack as they paced the hallway. Through her window she could hear the crowd that still lingered in the street below. Their voices carried clearly in the night air. 5 mountain men and a preacher's girl, someone called out, followed by cruel laughter. Ain't that a fine tale for Sunday sermon? Shame on her father, a woman's voice added. Should have kept better watch on his daughter. Shame on her, you mean? Another answered. Those men'll hang come morning, mark my words. Mary's tears fell silently onto her clasped hands, but her prayers never wavered. Dear God, she whispered, give me voice to speak truth tomorrow. Let them see your light in darkness. Help me stand strong, no matter what comes. The floorboards creaked as one of the elders stopped outside her door. Time for sleep, Miss Haskin, he called gruffly. Big day tomorrow. Mary didn't respond, but she rose from her knees and sat on the bed's edge. She wouldn't sleep tonight, couldn't sleep knowing 5 good men sat in chains while lies spread like poison through the town. Instead, she began, reciting psalms under her breath, letting David's ancient words of courage fill her heart. In the sheriff's office, Roy Heller sat at his desk, staring at nothing. The lamp's flame had burned low, casting strange shadows on the walls. He could hear his prisoners praying in the back cells, their voices carrying faintly through the building. His deputy, Tom, had gone home hours ago, but Heller couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about Mary Haskin's face when her father grabbed her arm kept haunting him. He'd seen that look before, on women trapped in bad marriages, on children who flinched at raised voices. Should have done something then, he muttered to himself, rubbing his tired eyes. Should have stopped him right there. Outside his window, he could see several men gathered near the lumberyard, pointing at spaces between buildings. They were still discussing where to build the gallows, though no trial had even started. The sight made his stomach turn. Law's got to work its course, he repeated Luca's words from earlier. But whose law, man's or God's? The question sat heavy in his chest as the night wore on. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness. Mary watched the stars fade through her window, her resolve growing stronger with each passing hour. She had changed from the borrowed men's clothes into a simple dark dress, but refused the elaborate Sunday clothes Sister Martha had tried to force on her. She wouldn't pretend to be something she wasn't. Not anymore. The first pink light of morning found her standing straight and calm, though her face was pale from the sleepless night. When Elder Thompson knocked on her door, she answered clearly, "I'm ready." In the jail cells, the men stirred from their uncomfortable positions on the bench and floor. None had truly slept, but a strange peace had settled over them during their night of prayer. Ephraim's tiny wooden cross had made its way around several more times, a tangible reminder of greater truths than man's justice. Luke stretched his stiff shoulders as best he could with the shackles. "Whatever happens today," he said quietly, "I'm proud to stand with you all." "Amen to that," Hank agreed, while Walt nodded solemnly. Luca looked at each of his friends, these men who had become his family through years of sharing trails and troubles. "Mary will speak truth," he said with certainty. "After that, it's in God's hands." Sheriff Heller arrived early, looking like he hadn't slept either. He stood at his desk, watching through the window as townspeople began gathering in the street. The morning sun cast long shadows as men continued to discuss the possibility of gallows. Building before judging, he muttered, disgust clear in his voice. He had seen this before, how quickly people could turn ugly when fear and rumors took hold. But this time, watching Mary being led from the parsonage toward his office, he felt something shift inside his chest. The girl walked with her head high, ignoring the whispers and pointing fingers. Despite her small size, she seemed to carry a strength that made the watching crowd fall quiet as she passed. Her guards, the church elders, had to hurry to keep up with her determined stride. Through the jail's barred windows, 5 sets of eyes watched her approach. Each man straightened instinctively, drawing strength from her example. Ephraim's fingers moved to touch the wooden cross now hidden in his shirt pocket. Mary's step faltered only once, when she heard someone in the crowd shout, "Gallows for the mountain devils!" But she kept walking, her prayers a steady rhythm matching her heartbeat. Truth would be her weapon today, and faith her shield. The morning sun climbed higher over Silverton's rooftops, promising another bright spring day. But in the hearts and minds of those gathered, darker weather was brewing. The trial of 5 mountain men and the testimony of one preacher's daughter would soon shake this town's foundations to their core. Sheriff Heller watched Mary enter his office, noting how she carried herself like someone much older than her 19 years. She met his eyes directly, and he saw there not fear, but a calm determination that made him stand straighter himself. "I'm ready to speak truth," she said simply. The sheriff nodded slowly, feeling the weight of coming choices pressing down on him. Behind him, in the cells, 5 men continued their silent prayers. Outside, the crowd grew larger, their voices a rising tide of judgment. And through it all, Mary stood unwavering, her faith a quiet flame that would soon be tested in ways none could predict. The morning light streamed through the office windows, catching dust motes in its beams. It touched Mary's face gently, highlighting the strength in her young features. She had entered that snowstorm weeks ago as a frightened girl, but she stood here now as a woman of conviction, ready to defend those who had shown her true Christian charity. The Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost sparkling on every window pane in Silverton. Church bells rang out across the valley, their bronze voices calling the faithful to worship. The sound echoed off the mountains, as if heaven itself was summoning witnesses. Townspeople streamed toward the white-painted chapel, their boots crunching on frozen grass. Their whispered conversations centered on judgment, not God's, but their own. "Those mountain men'll get what's coming," muttered one deacon to another. "The Lord sorts out his own," came the reply. In the parsonage guest room, Mary sat perfectly still, listening to the bells. Her guards had grown careless after their sleepless night. Elder Thompson dozed in his chair while Brother Jenkins had stepped away. Just for a moment. The door wasn't even locked. Moving silently as morning mist, Mary slipped from her room. Her stockinged feet made no sound on the wooden floors. At the back door, she paused only long enough to offer a prayer of thanks before stepping outside into the biting air. The ground was cold beneath her feet as she crossed the short distance to the chapel. She could hear her father's voice already booming through the open windows, fierce with righteous anger. Mary's heart thundered in her chest, but her steps never faltered. Inside the chapel, Reverend Abel Haskins' face was flushed with passion as he gripped the pulpit edges. "Beware, my flock," he thundered, spittle flying from his lips. "Beware the wolves who dress in men's skins. They prowl our mountains, waiting to devour the innocent." The congregation sat rigid in their pews, many nodding in solemn agreement. None noticed the side door opening quietly, or the slim figure who slipped inside. "These devils mock our faith," Reverend Haskin continued, his voice rising. "They steal our daughters, corrupt our—" Mary's bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor as she stepped into the center aisle. But somehow her presence sent a ripple through the church. Heads turned. Gasps broke the sermon's flow. Someone whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Her father's words stuttered to a stop as he saw her. For a moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the bell tower. Mary walked steadily forward, her simple dress and unbound hair a stark contrast to the Sunday finery around her. Her face was pale but calm as she approached the pulpit steps. "Mary," her father warned, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Return to your room at once." Instead, she climbed the pulpit stairs. The congregation held its collective breath. Even the babies seemed to sense the tension, falling silent in their mother's arms. The large Bible lay open on the pulpit. Mary's hands trembled slightly as she turned its pages, but her voice rang clear and true as she began to read. "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone." The words hung in the air like morning frost. Mary lifted her eyes to scan the crowd, meeting their gazes one by one. "These men showed Christian charity when others turned away," she said. "They saved my life while this town watched me bleed in the snow." Reverend Haskin's face had gone from red to white. His hands shook as he gripped the pulpit rail, the same hands that had struck his daughter so many times before. The truth of Christ's words about stones and sin seemed to pierce him like arrows. At the back of the church, Sheriff Heller stood quietly. As Mary's words faded into silence, he removed his hat and bowed his head. One by one, others followed suit, until the entire congregation sat with heads bowed in reflection. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting colors across the wooden floors. They fell across Mary's bare feet, transforming them into something almost sacred, feet that had walked through snow and suffering to bring truth into this house of God. Her father stared at those same feet, remembering perhaps how they had stumbled away from his door that winter night. His shoulders began to shake, not with rage this time, but with something deeper. The truth had finally broken through his carefully constructed walls of righteousness. The silence in the chapel was absolute, not the silence of judgment now, but the silence of revelation. Each person there felt the weight of Mary's words and their own roles in what had transpired. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like silent prayers in the air. The silence shattered as Deacon Morris, his weathered frame trembling, rose slowly from his pew. "I can't keep quiet no more," he announced, his voice quavering. "I seen Reverend Haskin take money from that railroad man, Mr. Pratt. There's papers hidden under the floorboards, right beneath the altar." The congregation erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Mr. Pratt, who'd been sitting smugly near the back, bolted for the door. But Hank Doyle's powerful frame filled the doorway, blocking his escape. The half-Cherokee blacksmith's strong hands gripped Pratt's shoulders, holding him firm. Sheriff Heller's boots echoed on the wooden floors as he strode forward. "Show me these papers," he commanded. Two men pried up the loose boards, revealing a stack of documents detailing illegal land sales and water rights. "Release those men," the sheriff ordered, his voice carrying across the chapel. "Get down to the jail and unlock those cells right now." Reverend Haskin crumpled to his knees beside the pulpit, his face buried in trembling hands. The proud preacher looked small now, broken by the weight of his sins. Luca Creed, just freed from his chains, approached quietly and knelt beside him. "It's never too late to tell the truth," Luca said softly, his voice gentle with hard-won wisdom. Mary descended the pulpit steps, tears streaming down her face. She knelt beside her father, taking his weathered hands in hers. "I forgive you, Papa," she whispered, her voice carrying in the hushed church. "God's mercy is bigger than all our sins." The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, touching each face in the congregation as they witnessed grace made real before their eyes. Spring's first warmth seemed to fill the chapel, melting winter's bitter cold just as surely as truth had melted their hearts of stone. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the ridge as townspeople gathered where the mountain men's cabin had weathered so many storms. Mary stood among them, her eyes bright with purpose as she watched Luca and the others mark out the foundation for something new, a mission cabin that would serve as both church and schoolhouse. Widow Jensen arrived with her wagon full of tools, the wooden handles worn smooth from years of honest work. "Ain't much," she said, "but they're sturdy and true." The tools passed from hand to hand as children darted between adults, collecting stones for the foundation. Hank Doyle's forge rang out clear across the valley as he shaped the bell frame, each strike of his hammer echoing like a heartbeat against the mountainside. Near the growing walls, Ephraim Pike worked in reverent silence, his skilled hands bringing forth an altar cross from raw pine, each cut precise and purposeful. Sheriff Heller shed his badge and coat, rolling up his sleeves to help with the heavy roof beams. "Guess we all could use some fixing," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Building's good for the soul." Mary moved among the workers, her once trembling hands now steady and sure as she carried timber and passed water. She'd found her strength in service, just as the town had found its healing in shared labor. The sound of hammers filled the air where whispers and accusations had once poisoned the wind. Day flowed into day, and the cabin rose steadily against the sky. Walls that once divided now sheltered all who came seeking peace. The mountain air carried the scent of fresh-cut wood and new beginnings, while the ridge that had once hidden secrets now cradled hope in plain sight. The men's shovels struck rock as they dug the mission's well, the rhythmic scraping echoing across the ridge. Sweat dripped from their brows in the afternoon sun, when suddenly Hank's tool slipped through empty space. "Hold," Luca called out, dropping to his knees beside the hole. A hollow sound rumbled beneath them, and then, like God's own blessing, clear water burst forth from the earth. The spring gushed clean and strong, cascading over the rocks in crystalline streams. Mary rushed forward, her skirts gathering dust as she knelt beside the flowing water. With trembling hands, she cupped the pure spring water in her palms. Tears mixed with the crystal drops as they spilled through her fingers. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Luca stood tall, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "This water belongs to no man," he declared. "It's free for all who thirst, no deeds or money required. That's God's own promise." The news spread through town like wildfire. People came running with buckets, pails, and jars. Children laughed and splashed in the overflow, while older women filled their containers, speaking of miracles. Widow Jensen led them in, amazing grace, her strong voice lifted to heaven as others joined in harmony. As the sun began to set, Mary climbed the ladder beside the mission's door. With careful strokes, she painted words from Scripture across the rough-hewn timber. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden." Below her, the spring continued to flow, a living testament to grace restored. Each drop caught the fading sunlight like diamonds, precious and free, just as mercy should be. The water's gentle music mixed with hymns and laughter, healing old wounds with each passing moment. The mountain morning dawned crisp and clear 3 weeks after the spring's discovery. Mary knelt in her small garden beside the mission. tending to young tomato plants. The spring's constant melody mingled with birdsong as she worked, her hands gentle in the dark soil. Movement caught her eye, a lone figure trudging up the ridge path. Mary straightened, shading her eyes against the sun. Her heart skipped when she recognized her father's stooped form. Reverend Abel Haskin looked smaller somehow, his clothes hanging loose on his gaunt frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, speaking of sleepless nights. Mary set down her watering pail, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed her apron. The Reverend stopped a few paces away, his weathered face etched with pain and regret. Without a word, he fell to his knees in the dirt. "Mary," he choked out, "I don't deserve to ask, but please forgive me." His proud shoulders shook with sobs. Tears blurred Mary's vision as she stepped forward, reaching down to help him stand. "You were my first teacher of God, Pa," she said softly, her voice steady despite her tears. "I only forgot who he really was for a while. We both did." Father and daughter wept together, years of hurt washing away like spring snow. From the mission's porch, Luca, Hank, Ephraim, Walt, and Luke watched silently, their hats held over their hearts in respect for this sacred moment. The Reverend wiped his eyes and turned toward the men. They formed a circle, heads bowed as Abel prayed with them for the first time. When he finished, he spoke with quiet determination. "I'll help teach reading to the orphans here, if you'll have me." Mary's smile was as bright as the morning sun reflecting off the spring waters. The circle of prayer had grown by one more soul made new. The Easter sunrise painted the valley in gold. From the mission's new bell tower, clear tones rang out across Silverton for the first time, calling all to worship. The 5 mountain men, Luca, Hank, Ephraim, Walt, and Luke, stood shoulder to shoulder on the wooden steps, faces lifted in reverence. Mary's clear voice rose above the gathering crowd, leading Amazing Grace as miners in clean shirts, widows in Sunday best, native families in bright shawls, and weathered cowhands joined in harmony. Luca opened the worn Bible, reading with quiet strength. "He maketh the barren land springs of water." Looking out over the scene, smoke curling from the mission's chimney into azure skies, the town's restored church gleaming white below, snow-capped peaks shining, Mary felt peace settle in her heart. She understood now that she had never been useless, only waiting to be used by grace. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.